Hello, this is Daniel Torres Dwyer. Welcome to the FMCG Guys podcast for this special episode about Amazon. Around a month ago, Amazon announced it would be cutting ties with some EU distributors which are representing FMCG brands. I wanted to learn more about what that will mean for the 1P model at Amazon and more widely for the FMCG industry. So I invited an Amazon expert. His name is Martin Heubel, and he will be joining us from the UK to tell us more about these changes and the implications for the industry. Hello and welcome to the FMCG Guys. I'm your host, Daniel Torres Dwyer. Today, hosting alone for a special episode with Martin Heubel. Martin Heubel is an Amazon specialist, actually ex-Amazonian himself, who now helps companies work better with vendor managers at Amazon. But I'll let him go more into detail about it. Hi, Martin. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Daniel. Thanks for having me. How are you doing today?
Very good, very good. And pleasure to have you here. It's funny how we connected, because I think I shared about this news that will go into at Amazon and that will change things for FMCG players. And I think somebody tagged you, right?
Yeah, I think it was quite an interesting moment because I woke up on, I think it was the middle, so 15th of February this year, to loads of messages also on LinkedIn from parts of my audience that pinged me highlighting that Amazon has sent them an email with a significant change of their distribution model, which we'll go into a little bit more. And I think it's quite interesting how it resonated in the field. And of course, I mean, also the new relationships that we were able to build throughout it, right? So I think out of every bad news, so to say, there's something that or good you can take out of in our industry.
Well, it must be very comforting as well that people in your network are going to you to ask you about that, no?
Yeah, for sure. I think, look, I mean, at the end of the day, the vendor industry around Amazon, we always think that it is very big, but it really comes down to a very narrow niche, I would almost say, of brands that have kind of reflected their wholesale business on and with Amazon outside of the third-party seller space. And this is oftentimes also related to the historical arrangements, right, where they started maybe out on 3P, then moved to 1P. And I think if you're looking out on the internet, but also on LinkedIn in general, for resources that really give good insights, detailed insights, there's not much out there. Whereas for FBA and 3P, you typically find vast loads of information everywhere and from anyone.
Because basically, just to clarify also for the audience that may not be familiar with it, so the 3P model, which is the one that's most popular, what does that mean exactly?
Sure. So generally speaking, you can kind of split the Amazon business model into two parts. You can either become a seller yourself, so you simply sign up to Amazon. It is available to literally anyone and everyone to kind of create an account and to start selling through the platform. You can either use Amazon to handle your fulfillment, or you can even use your own fulfillment structures to send your products to the end shopper. But for companies and wholesalers that need a little bit of a more sophisticated business structure, maybe because they also don't have their own fulfillment structures in place to kind of send products and parcels to the end customer, Amazon offers the first party or vendor central model, where it's significantly different from 3P because Amazon is actually sending a purchasing order to the brand. And from the moment the brand fulfills this purchasing order, the ownership of the stock and inventory flows and goes onto Amazon, which also gives Amazon the ability to price the product accordingly on its website. So also the pricing ownership sits entirely with Amazon, similar to with typical retailers, whereas on the third-party seller central model, the seller or kind of supplier themselves can set the price on and at Amazon.
Yeah. So if we had to compare it to like traditional retail, 3P would be a concession and 1P would be a key account, basically.
Correct. Yeah, exactly.
Got
And I
it.
think what's interesting about the vendor model is, and this will lead us into the news that we're going to discuss in a second, is that the vendor model is an invite-only program. So typically Amazon historically has gone and has said, okay, here are a couple of brands that are doing very well. Let's kind of move them onto the vendor model. Thereby we can kind of cater to a more personal relationship. We can kind of have a dedicated buyer. Amazon calls them vendor managers that take care of this trade relationship and not only ensure that these accounts grow and do that in a profitable way, but also to ensure that, for example, specific supply chain initiatives that can lower the variable handling and shipping costs even further for both Amazon and for brands are well taken care of.
Yeah, and basically, Martin, just to also so the audience knows, whoever in the audience doesn't know you, because I'm sure that a few people will, just you basically specialize in helping FMCG companies work on the 1P vendor management model, right?
Yeah, correct. So my focus is entirely on the vendor central side of things. I also don't necessarily help brands to sell more on Amazon, such as a lot of agencies or freelance consultants are doing it. My focus is really on helping first-party vendors to make sense of the Amazon business model and help them to increase their profit margins. And typically that is being achieved by really looking at the individual cost centers, looking at where investments can be reallocated in order to increase the return on investment or the growth impact, but also by accompanying companies throughout the annual negotiations where they have to once in a year discuss and negotiate their trading terms with the Amazon vendor manager.
Yeah, which, by the way, I think it's worth mentioning, you were a vendor manager in Amazon before, so...
That's correct. Yeah. So I started out my journey with Amazon back in 2016, started in their German part of the business in the home house first category, before I then back in 2018 moved into the UK and took responsibility for the fast moving consumer goods category, snacks and desserts, but also coffee. So everything, I saw a little bit of everything from heavy and bulky product categories up to really fast moving consumer goods, where of course also I would say lifespan of a vendor is slightly different, and also the kind of challenges around smaller products that are really fast moving and have entirely different cost structures are a much different challenge as compared to when you sell, for example, washing machines or housewares in general.
Yeah, well, in the show notes, I'll link your name to your LinkedIn profile. So if anyone wants to get in touch with Martin, you're more than welcome to, unless Martin says the contrary.
No, I appreciate it. Typically, the best way to connect is really on LinkedIn, and I'm looking forward to connect with everyone.
Perfect. So Martin, going back to the origin of our connection, what's happening at Amazon? What is this big change in the 1P model that will change things, as far as I'm concerned, for some FMCG players?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. And I think, look, everyone who is in touch with the Amazon industry knows that it's a very dynamic place. There are news coming front, left, right, and center almost every day to our screens on social media and offside of it. But one of the more interesting and more significant changes over the recent, I would say, couple of months is that Amazon has decided to cut its ties with a large number of distributors here in Europe in order to gain greater control over its relationships with brands, but also in order to ensure that they can tap into their influence and increase their influence over the costs and the product selection that they have available. So in plain English, that means that a lot of distributors and wholesalers to Amazon who are vendors, so are selling over the 1P business model to Amazon, have received an email in mid to late February highlighting that Amazon will cease the business relationship with them over the coming months or even years. So we have seen everything from mid of April 2023 to all the way to April of 2024, which of course comes as a huge shock for these manufacturers, or not manufacturers, but necessarily the distributors and wholesalers of these manufacturers, who are now facing a very real impact to their overall business model, specifically when they're quite dependent on these sales with Amazon.
Yeah, because are there many of the FMCG companies? I don't know if you have a percentage, but do you know if many of them work with Amazon through distributors? Is it common?
Yeah. So especially smaller brands that are manufacturing, for example, locally in the UK or in Germany, they have, of course, an interest to having their products reflected on Amazon, but they typically do not have necessarily the resources to doing that themselves. So they often use distributors or wholesalers in order to kind of close that gap. But it's worth noting that these brands are also not necessarily impacted by it. So Amazon has not a problem with distributors or wholesalers expanding the selection of brands that would otherwise not be able to kind of sell on Amazon, as long as these brands have given these distributors formally exclusive distribution and also the brand ownership rights to manage their business on Amazon. And as long as a distributor and a wholesaler can prove through brand registry, but also through other paperwork to Amazon that this is the case, and Amazon is also not directly sourcing from this brand as a vendor account the products in parallel, those distributors will usually not run into any issues. Where it becomes interesting is when you look at all of these FMCG companies that have historically said, okay, we have 1,000 products, maybe 200 of these are not profitable for us to sell to Amazon via Vendor Central. Let's just offshore that to maybe a wholesaler or distributor, which is often referred to as a 2P model, so sitting in between 1P and 3P with Amazon. And this is where Amazon says, hold on a second, we kind of want the entire portfolio and selection from you as the manufacturer. We do not want to purchase these 200 items that are technically unprofitable for you from a middleman, i.e. a distributor who needs to take a cut out for themselves in order to fund their business model, meaning that we as Amazon will not be able to access the best possible cost price in the market. And this is where this filter of exclusivity rights and brand ownership comes in, because those distributors who just have part of the portfolio, but kind of are a vendor to Amazon next to the manufacturing brand, those are the ones that are targeted by these emails, which highlight that the trading relationship is going to cease over the coming months. And this is where Amazon is also going very clearly against brands and manufacturers who have decided to kind of try to trick the system, try to kind of offshore a certain part of their selection to distributors in order to not give Amazon the best possible cost price, but also to kind of rid themselves from the very tough negotiations around matching compensation or cost support agreements that would usually a vendor manager have to table to them if they were to offer all of these unprofitable items to Amazon over their own manufacturing account.
And what consequences can you foresee of these changes in FMCG companies?
Well, I mean, if you look at the distributors, I mean, for them, it will be a tough time, right? Because if your retailer or retail partner says we are going to cease the trade relationship, then there is not so much that you can do unless asking the brand to give you exclusivity rights for the territory in Europe or for exclusive brand ownership rights. And here it really depends, okay, what is the setting? But in most cases, these brands and these distributors are going to have to move to, for example, a third-party model, which requires very different capabilities, very different skill sets from a human resource perspective. But of course, they will also have to kind of invest into different third-party service providers that help them to figure out the manual price setting, but also inventory management that is slightly different on Seller Central compared to Vendor Central. When we look at the impact for these fast-moving consumer goods companies, they are all of a sudden confronted with a choice. They need to kind of decide whether they want to take on board the selection that was previously given to Amazon by the distributors themselves, or whether they are willing to kind of offshore this selection towards a third-party Seller Central model where the distributor goes and says, okay, we're offering it to Amazon now indirectly through the marketplace business. There is an interesting concept here in Europe, which is the manufacturing on Amazon policy. And this is where a lot of brands are getting surprised by. You can Google it. It's available on the internet for everyone to read. where Amazon specifically outlines that as the part of its terms and conditions with vendors and manufacturing vendors, Amazon can force you to offer your selection if you're the manufacturer only via Vendor Central, not via Seller Central. And while Amazon is not known to enforce this radically in Europe, there is, of course, a certain risk that vendor managers, especially with brands that are their key focus and also their key profitability drivers in a category, may reach out to brands and say, hold on a second, you cannot just have your distributor now offering the selection via Seller Central. We actually want to have that.
Seller Central, which is the 3P model, right?
Which is the 3P model, correct.
Got it. Of course, because then, makes sense. Because then you can basically, Amazon loses control of the price, for example, and it could be like disloyal competition, I guess, no?
Right, and I think it targets brands that are saying and making themselves the life easy and say, okay, if Amazon wants more margin, we just kind of rid ourselves from unprofitable products and we are just listing it via 3P, which of course is also not in Amazon's interest, because for them, their business model, which is often reflected in this flywheel that is famously known and was introduced by Jeff Bezos, starts with having selection available. And if you then pair the selection with a good customer experience, this leads to growth. But without having the selection and without being able to price the selection accordingly and to have the availability of that selection in check, it will become very hard for Amazon to actually track whether they are able to get customers into the category and to attract them. Because let's also not forget the reason why this Vendor Central model exists in the first place is to have all of the A brands of each category listed and to have a direct relationship with them. Why? Because if you and I go onto Amazon and we type in Lego in, for example, the toys category, we expect these products to be available on Amazon. How can Amazon ensure that? Well, they need to have the direct relationship with the manufacturer. And this is exactly where the equation comes in of the news of cutting out distributors of the overall business relationship, because they interfere with that kind of notion of having this direct relationship. And it also forces brands that have never sold to Amazon directly, but have also not given distributors territorial rights or brand ownership rights, to maybe start having this discussion around the beginning of the direct trade relationship with Amazon as well.
Yeah. And I know that these changes of policies, having spoken before with you, are coming with some changes within Amazon, some certain consolidation of vendor management. Tell me more.
Sure. Look, I mean, I think what doesn't come as a surprise to a lot of us is that Amazon has had a fantastic growth trajectory throughout the pandemic. But these net sales have actually declined more and more over the last few months. So we actually have seen that Amazon is now having a guidance for net sales that are around 4 to 8% year over year. And of course, this also entails, for example, its cloud computing division such as AWS, but a lot of this growth is also coming out of more emerging parts of its business, such as Amazon advertising. So retail is actually flat or only growing very slightly. And this may, of course, differ from category to category. But overall, Amazon has a growth problem. And at the same time, they have significantly invested against capital expenditures that they had throughout the pandemic, whether it was warehouse space or whether it was also the optimization of the delivery and fulfillment speed. Correct. So one-day delivery, etc. So Amazon is now really shifting from an availability and expansion focus that we've seen over the last few years during COVID to a profitability focus, where their key objective is to optimize their profit margins. And part of that has been expressed also as a signal to shareholders to become more efficient in the famously known layoffs that Amazon has announced over recent months, with over 20,000 corporate roles being at risk and also part of these layoffs. Now, naturally speaking, divisions that have low profit margins and are also not necessarily outgrowing every other division in Amazon are part of that. So the retail division is very much included in those layoffs. roughly 15% of vendor managers are expected here in Europe to cease to exist by the end of the year, which is quite significant because the number of brands is not going to decrease.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? We now have fewer buyers on Amazon's side managing a similar or even larger number of vendors and brands. And that comes naturally with a question for Amazon on where to spend these resources very wisely. Because, of course, Amazon is not going to deploy more and more resources anytime soon. And this is where, of course, also this decision around cutting out distributors was part of it, because if you can focus your resources on the direct brand and manufacturer relationship, then this is naturally what they're going to do. On the other hand, what we are seeing specifically here in Europe is that Amazon is focusing more and more also in consumer goods categories on a regionalized approach. So instead of deploying 9 vendor managers for all of the key 9 EU countries that repeat kind of the discussions with brands locally in every single market, Amazon has gone already almost a decade ago in more mature hardlines categories and has said, okay, let's just consolidate these discussions and let's kind of incentivize our brands and manufacturers that we are having a direct trade relationship with to rather discuss trading terms, our trade strategy, but also our marketing and shopper activation strategies at a regionalized pan-European level.
Yeah.
And while Amazon has pushed into that direction for quite some while, only recently, actually at the back end of last year, Amazon has done a significant restructure in its retail division, where now instead of 9 individual vendor managers, 1 lead European vendor manager or buyer has been appointed to work with individual vendors or to work with aggregated European team, commercial team from vendor side.
So I remember before you had like vendor managers and senior vendor managers reporting into a head of vendor management. Is that changed or?
Well, the structure itself is fairly similar. So you still have vendor managers and senior vendor managers, for example, reporting into a category leader, and the category leader is reporting into a sales director, but they are not localized anymore. So they may sit in different countries, but they now have a European ownership. So instead of, for example, having the UK ownership of a category like pet food or snacks and desserts and grocery, that has now moved across Europe. Meaning that if I am a vendor manager and I own a brand such as, for example, Mars or Nestle, I own this relationship across Europe, not only for a single country.
Yeah. Which will be interesting because if anything, Europe is still like very localized in terms of the retail landscape, even some consumer habits, etc. So it does sound like quite a risky bet, really. I mean, I guess that the only ones that really do this in some way are Lidl and Aldi, no? Who have like
correct. I mean, I think you see it with Aldi, who has brought in more and more their global sourcing team. You see it with Carrefour, who has a similar setup across Europe. But other than that, you do not see that much. And I think the key difference between Amazon and those retailers is that those retailers typically have a significantly higher share in the overall revenue that they make with the brand as compared to Amazon, where the share in fast-moving consumer goods categories is between sometimes less than 1% all the way up to maybe 5% on average for the large multinationals. And I think this is the key difference where Amazon struggles to have enough commercial leverage to really kind of gently nudge these brands to follow suit. But I think we also need to look at the reality of things, right? Amazon is not going to reduce, they are going to reduce more headcount. They are not going to deploy more resources anytime soon. And that leaves really brands with a question on whether they don't need to at least partially respond to this new regionalized European setup.
Yeah. Are there any other changes that you can foresee happening within the next 6 months?
I think typically Amazon conducts the largest changes to its business model on the back of the fourth and the first quarter. which is very ironic because those are also the quarters where most business is typically being done and also materialized. But usually throughout these summer months or also late spring ones, you do not see a lot of these fundamental changes. So I think what the current CEO, Andy Jassy, is now focusing on is to kind of smooth out the overall retail division. I think the layoffs, to the extent that they have been announced and happened, will unlikely to be extended at this point. I think it was primarily a signal to shareholders to highlight, look, we're becoming more efficient. And I think brands really need to focus, especially in Europe, around, okay, how are they responding to the ever-increasing profitability focus that vendor managers, but also the Amazon system in general, is putting on them? Because those questions are not going to go away just because you are closing your annual trade term negotiation, for example. Because also algorithmically, I would expect that Amazon becomes more and more aggressive with listings and delisting decisions when products fall beneath certain thresholds when it comes to profit margins or also the availability towards end shoppers.